You knew how to read a room before you knew how to read a book. Not because anyone taught you, because you had no other choice. And the strange thing is, most people who grew up this way never think of it as unusual. They call it being mature. But here is what nobody tells you about growing up too fast. It is not a personality type. It is a nervous system that learned to work overtime before it was ever ready. You were the one who noticed the tension before a single word was spoken. You made yourself smaller when the room needed it, and steadier when someone else was falling apart. You remembered everyone's needs, managed everyone's moods, and somehow still felt like you were never quite doing enough. You became, without anyone asking you to, the person the whole thing leaned on. And now you are an adult who finds it almost impossible to let anyone lean back toward you. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why, and it will make more sense than anything you have told yourself about it so far. Here is what I want to name clearly, because I think it matters. This is not a story about bad parenting or difficult homes, not always. For a lot of people who grew up too fast, the home was not chaotic. It was just quietly missing something. A parent who was present in the room but absent in the ways that counted, a household that functioned but only because one small person inside it was working much harder than anyone noticed. Someone like Maya, she was the kid who sat with her mom after hard nights, who knew which topics to avoid around her dad, who made sure her younger brother did not feel the weight of whatever was happening at the top of the house. She was not suffering dramatically. She was just always on. Psychologists call this parentification, the process of a child stepping into emotional or practical adult roles before their nervous system was ever built to carry them. But here's what most people miss about parentification. It does not always look like a crisis. Sometimes it looks like a very capable, very reliable, very perceptive kid that every adult in the room quietly depends on. I want to call this the anchor child pattern. The one who held still so everyone else could move, who steadied the room so others could fall apart, who made themselves useful so consistently that useful became the only version of themselves they knew how to be. And here is where it gets more complicated than most people realize. Researchers studying early caregiving roles have found that children who take on consistent emotional management responsibilities develop what amounts to a finely tuned social radar, a near constant background scan of the emotional temperature of every room they enter. That radar does not switch off when childhood ends. It just keeps running in every workplace, every friendship, every relationship, scanning for what the room needs, for who is uncomfortable, for what might be about to go wrong. Someone like Daniel grew up being the one who kept the peace between his parents, and he is now, at 34, the most emotionally attuned person in every room he walks into. People describe him as remarkably present, a great listener, someone who always seems to know what you need before you say it. What they do not see is how exhausting it is to never be able to turn the radar off. What they do not see is what happens when someone tries to give that same attention back to him. He deflects, he redirects the conversation back to them. He says he is fine before anyone finishes asking. And this is where it gets personal. Think about the last time someone offered to genuinely take care of you, not as a transaction, just as a simple act of giving. What was your very first internal response? Not the polite one you said out loud, the one that happened a half second before that. For most anchor children, that first response is not relief. It is something closer to suspicion or discomfort or a quiet calculating question. What will this cost me later? Here is the insight that tends to stop people cold. The anchor child does not struggle to receive care because they do not want it. They struggle because their nervous system learned very early that love and need arrive together, and that the safest way to stay loved was to be the one doing the needing for everyone else. Being needed was how they knew they were wanted. That is the part nobody says out loud. And here is the reframe: what the anchor child built in childhood was not a flaw. It was engineering, precise, intelligent, context-specific engineering designed for the exact environment they were living in. The nervous system read the situation and adapted to it with remarkable accuracy. The problem is not that the adaptation was wrong, it is that adaptations do not automatically update when the environment changes. The radar keeps running long after the original emergency is over. The hand stays extended, reaching out, holding steady, giving, because that hand never learned what it felt like to simply rest. Maya, at 29, told a close friend for the first time that she was tired, not in a crisis, just genuinely tired and needing someone to sit with it. She felt uncomfortable for 2 days afterward, as though she had broken a rule she had never agreed to follow. But nothing collapsed. The friend stayed, and something very small shifted. Not a breakthrough, just a single piece of new evidence that being on the receiving end did not make her less worthy of the room. Daniel started doing something similar. When people asked how he was, he began pausing before he answered, actually checking rather than producing the automatic response he had rehearsed since childhood. Not every time, and not perfectly, but enough to start building a different kind of evidence. Here is what changes slowly for people who grew up too fast. Not a decision, not a resolution, just evidence gathered one small moment at a time that the room does not fall apart when you put something down. You spent years being the person everyone could count on, and you are extraordinarily good at it. That part is genuinely true about you. But being good at holding everything does not mean you were built to hold it alone forever. The anchor child learned to be needed before they learned to be known, and learning to be known is quieter work, slower, more uncomfortable, and more worth it than anything the radar ever found. If this one landed somewhere close, I want to ask you one thing. What is the first word that comes to mind when someone offers to genuinely help you? Not the word you say, the one that happens before that. Drop it in the comments, just one word.